Welcome to the debate. Last year, employment tribunals saw this massive surge in six-figure payouts over something that, well, most employees just casually dismiss as a joke.
Right. Like, why can't you just be normal?
Exactly. A colleague asks, why can't you just be normal regarding a coworker's communication style, and suddenly, boom, the employer is strictly liable for discrimination. So today, we are looking at a macro trend that is just radically reshaping employment law, the explosion of neurodiversity litigation.
Yeah, we are seeing tribunal claims involving autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette's. I mean, it is completely upending how companies operate on a daily basis.
It really is. And our specific focus today is the Neurodiversity Workplace Accountability Framework, or the NWAF legal architecture. It's a highly specific preventative framework designed to manage what they call neuroconduct, which is a fascinating term in itself.
Right? So we are tackling a fundamental question here. Does implementing a highly codified preventative neuroconduct governance system actually mitigate legal risk and protect employees? Or, does imposing a rigid behavioral taxonomy fundamentally misunderstand the complexities of human interaction?
Creating way more problems than it solves.
Exactly. So I will be taking the position that strict, proactive codification of behavior is the absolute only legally sound method to establish a defense under the Equality Act, as I will be arguing that while traditional HR policies are definitely structurally broken, reducing nuanced neurodivergent interactions to a rigid disciplinary matrix creates a really inflexible system. Attempting to algorithmically engineer workplace culture through a taxonomy is frankly perilous. And I think it's highly likely to fail the very tribunal scrutiny it so desperately seeks to pass.
Well, the reality we have to face right out of the gate is the strict mechanics of vicarious liability under Section 109 of the Equality Act 2010. I mean, the law is just brutally unforgiving here. Employers are strictly liable for discriminatory acts committed in the course of employment. And this liability attaches regardless of whether the employer knew about the behavior, regardless of whether they approved of it, and completely regardless of whether the employee committing the act thought they were just engaging in, harmless banter.
Right. The intent is essentially legally irrelevant.
Totally irrelevant. And traditional HR policies rely on these incredibly vague descriptors, words like offensive or inappropriate. In a modern tribunal setting, those policies are essentially void. They provide zero legal shield.
Yeah, they're too subjective.
Exactly. So to establish a defense, employers have to adopt the NWAF neuroconduct taxonomy. We need explicit categorization of microaggressions. Like, if an employee criticizes a neurodivergent colleague's literal communication style, that can't just be brushed off as a personality difference anymore.
No. Under Section 15 of the Equality Act, which covers discrimination arising from disability, that behavior needs to be classified
explicitly in the handbook as misconduct or gross misconduct. Furthermore, if you look at the Worker Protection Act 2023, it introduces a positive duty to prevent harassment. Passive compliance is dead. You cannot just leave a policy in a drawer. You must actively engineer a preventative defense.
I will absolutely acknowledge that traditional HR has deep structural failures. I mean, it is heavily biased toward neurotypical norms, and it systematically fails neurodivergent employees by relying on those subjective interpretations of professionalism.
Exactly.
And this is a massive but, the NWAF's approach to solving this, specifically by tackling these microaggressions through a rigidly updated disciplinary matrix, is legally and culturally perilous. The matrix strictly codifies specific phrases or actions,
Which is what the law requires for a defense.
Well, while it is true that under the law, the intent of the perpetrator is legally irrelevant and the effect on the victim is everything, evaluating workplace culture requires a deeply nuanced understanding of context.
Okay.
And the mechanical matrix simply lacks that capacity. If you impose rigid categorizations, like, let's say, taking an ignorant but perhaps genuinely curious question about why someone is wearing noise-canceling sensory tools,
And you immediately label it as harassment under Section 26 of the Equality Act. You force employers into disproportionate disciplinary actions. Tribunals scrutinize draconian and inflexible disciplinary processes just as rigorously as they scrutinize discrimination.
But see, you're evaluating this like a behavioral psychologist assessing a relationship.
I'm really not.
No. We have to look at this strictly from the perspective of an employment tribunal judge evaluating corporate liability. We have a crucial case law anchor here. Allay, UK Limited versus Gellin.
Right, the racial harassment case.
Exactly. In that case, Mr. Gellin was subjected to racial harassment by a colleague. The employer tried to use the reasonable steps defense under Section 109, pointing to anti-harassment training they had conducted for their staff. But the tribunal fundamentally rejected that defense.
Because the training was old?
Because it was delivered 20 months prior to the incidents. The judge ruled the training had become stale and had clearly faded from the employee's memories. So the defense completely failed, and the employer was fully liable.
Wow. Yeah.
This is precisely why the NWAF's implementation of cognitive decay monitoring is so vital. The system doesn't just train people, it explicitly expires that training after 12 to 18 months and triggers automatic learning management system reminders. From a judicial standpoint, preventing that staleness is exactly what a judge requires to see that a policy is an active, living mechanism, not a passive checkbox.
Judges are highly attuned to sophisticated box-ticking exercises, though. I mean, the NWAF relies heavily on what it calls audit-ready evidence logs.
Right. Tracking modules completed, scenarios covered.
Time spent on a slide, comprehension test scores. I just do not buy the premise that a tribunal judge will look at a spreadsheet of perfect comprehension scores and automatically equate that with a genuinely safe, equitable workplace culture.
Well, they equate it with reasonable steps.
Didn't they? Because if an employee comes to a tribunal with a documented history of severe neurodivergent masking fatigue caused by a toxic environment, those audit-ready evidence logs might actually backfire.
How so?
Because do LMS completion rates and refresher cycles actually shield the employer from vicarious liability, or do they just prove the employer knew exactly how to force a terrified workforce to click through a scenario-based curriculum to protect the company's bottom line?
But the Equality Act doesn't care about the company's soul. It cares about the guardrails.
That's a bit clinical, don't you think?
Think about strict occupational safety regulations on a construction site. A safety inspector doesn't walk onto the site and try to evaluate the vibe of the workplace.
Sure.
They don't ask how safety conscious the workers feel in their hearts. They evaluate documented, systemic, preventative governance. Are there mandatory hard hats? Are the guardrails at the exact required height? Is there a log showing the scaffolding was physically inspected at 7 a.m.?
Right, but human communication...
Wait. The NAAF taxonomy operates the exact same way for behavioral risk. It isn't trying to measure the empathy of the workforce. It is building the behavioral scaffolding. When a tribunal judge asks, "Did you take all reasonable steps?" the employer doesn't talk about feelings. They say, yes, we defined the specific neuroconduct risks, we trained the workforce, we anticipated the cognitive decay of that training, just as the All-A precedent demands, and here's the audit-ready proof.
Human communication isn't a hard hat, though.
It's an analogy.
But it breaks down. You can objectively measure if a piece of high-visibility plastic is sitting on someone's head. You cannot objectively measure the infinite variations of social interaction, tone, and context through an audit log.
Well, and this brings us directly to the mechanism of how these violations are actually caught and reported. The NAAF heavily champions a low-friction grievance architecture. Now, I will concede their foundational premise here. Traditional grievance systems are awful.
Absolutely awful.
They demand high executive function, intense emotional regulation, the ability to tolerate face-to-face confrontation, and the drafting of a highly structured chronological narrative.
They are an insurmountable barrier. The traditional system forces a neurodivergent employee who might already be experiencing severe masking fatigue,
which is the literal exhaustion of suppressing natural behaviors to pass as neurotypical. Exactly. It forces them to navigate a highly neurotypical bureaucratic maze. Sitting in a fluorescent-lit HR office, trying to decode real-time neurotypical social cues while explaining a microaggression, it causes a massive cortisol spike. It's a biological and cognitive tax.
Oh, absolutely.
That is why the NAWF digital system replaces the formal letter with an anonymous, asynchronous portal. It features a sensory-friendly user interface and allows for processing time rather than demanding synchronous, on-the-spot articulation. It removes the executive dysfunction barrier entirely by allowing the employee to report the incident on their own terms at their own pace.
I agree. It certainly removes the barrier to initiation, and it absolutely increases psychological safety for the reporter. But look at the legal reality of this architecture.
Okay.
You just stated we must evaluate this from the perspective of an employment tribunal. The law requires an employer to conduct a prompt, impartial investigation into allegations. How, practically speaking, does an employer conduct a thorough, legally defensible investigation based on asynchronous anonymous data fed through an encrypted chat portal?
Well, they use the data to map hotspots.
But it creates a massive catch-22, a severe visibility trap. The employer receives an anonymous ping through the NWAF portal. They now have actionable data telling them a problem exists.
Which triggers their positive duty to act under the Worker Protection Act.
Exactly. But because the system is designed to strip metadata and remain completely anonymous to protect the user, the employer lacks the specific details required to actually investigate or enforce their rigid disciplinary matrix. They are caught between knowing too much to legally claim ignorance and knowing too little to take decisive action.
I'll admit, that specific catch-22 is a massive investigatory headache.
It's a huge liability.
If you investigate aggressively to find the perpetrator, you shatter the psychological safety of the anonymous portal. If you do nothing, you violate the positive duty to prevent harassment. It is a genuine tension.
Right.
But the alternative, the traditional system you just admitted, is structurally broken, results in zero visibility.
True.
If the barrier to entry is so high that the neurodivergent employee simply suffers in silence until they face a catastrophic burnout or are forced into a constructive dismissal claim, the employer is entirely blind until the lawsuit literally lands on their desk. The low-friction architecture might present investigatory challenges regarding anonymity, but it maps the behavioral hotspots in the organization. It captures the microaggressions early, and that points us to exactly what is being reported through these portals. The BANter trap and how these policies actually interact with workplace culture.
The BANter trap is exactly where the tension between your taxonomy and actual human culture fractures completely.
Let's define it clearly based on the source material. The BANter trap occurs when discriminatory microaggressions are disguised as workplace humor. Neurodivergent employees are routinely targeted here.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Traits like literal communication, masking fatigue, sensory needs, or physical stimming are frequently misinterpreted by neurotypical colleagues as rudeness, aggression, or a lack of professionalism.
Right.
Look at the tribunal examples we have. In Ellis v. Cranswick Foods, we saw an autistic employee with ADHD who possessed a very direct communication style. Management repeatedly interpreted this directness as aggressive and insubordinate misconduct.
And the tribunal ruled that the behavior was a fundamental manifestation of the employee's disability.
Exactly, making the employer's punitive actions unlawful. And then in Rook v. NHS Blood and Transplant, a senior officer actively mocked a neurodivergent employee's communication traits under the guise of office banter, and the tribunal found it to be unlawful harassment.
Right.
The NWAF argues that you must explicitly codify these scenarios to stop them. If an employee mocks another's physical stimming movements and calls it unprofessional, the taxonomy categorizes that explicitly as gross misconduct. By making that a strict, undeniable rule, you actively re-engineer the workplace culture away from neurotypical bias. You stop the BANter trap before it starts.
Humor and social differences are infinitely complex, though, and algorithmic taxonomies cannot process complexity. Let's look at another example from the NWAF taxonomy itself.
Go ahead.
If an employee casually says, "Everyone's a bit ADHD," the NWAF standardizes this as diagnostic invalidation and categorizes it as gross misconduct.
Which it is.
Now, is that phrase dismissive? Yes. Can it be harmful to someone actually struggling with executive dysfunction? Absolutely. But is the optimal solution to immediately escalate an ignorant comment to the highest disciplinary tier, threatening immediate termination?
Well,
I argue that doing so creates a culture of absolute paranoia. If every misplaced question about an executive function difference or asking a colleague why the headphones again is immediately categorized as harassment or victimization, you are not fostering inclusion. You are weaponizing compliance. You are forcing HR to act as a punitive algorithm rather than a mediator of human conflict.
But without that explicit gross misconduct categorization, what is the alternative? The behavior is inevitably downgraded by traditional HR to a personality clash.
Not always.
We see it all the time. HR says, "Oh, John is just a bit direct and Sarah is just being a bit sensitive. Let's all just get along." That exact downgrading is how employers fall into the vicarious liability trap in the first place.
Well, sure, that happens
Because it is not a personality clash, it is a structural, systemic misinterpretation of neurodivergent traits. The reason the NWAF insists on a scenario-based curriculum, training employees specifically on literal communication scenarios and sensory accommodation scenarios, is precisely to eliminate the excuse of ignorance. Once you are trained and that training is tracked via cognitive decay monitoring, saying everyone's a bit ADHD isn't an innocent slip of the tongue anymore. It is a calculated violation of a known boundary.
You are assuming the training perfectly translates into human empathy and behavioral change. Testing employees on legal thresholds is vastly better than having them read a static PDF handbook, I'll give you that.
Right.
But you cannot algorithmically map every human interaction. What if a neurodivergent employee uses self-deprecating dark humor to cope with their own diagnosis? And what if a neurotypical colleague, genuinely trying to build rapport and connection, mirrors that exact same dark humor? Under your rigid taxonomy, the neurotypical employee has just committed gross misconduct. The matrix cannot account for rapport, tone, or relational context. Tribunals absolutely look at context. If an employer fires someone over a clumsy attempt at connection simply because the matrix demanded it, they are highly likely to face an unfair dismissal claim from that terminated employee.
So they get sued either way.
Exactly. The rigid taxonomy solves one liability by creating an entirely new one.
That brings us to an unavoidable crossroads, doesn't it? If both traditional HR and rigid taxonomy create their own distinct legal hazards, where does that leave the employer looking to comply with the new positive duty to prevent harassment?
It leaves them in a very tough spot.
Let me summarize my position based on the legal reality we face. We are operating in an environment defined by strict liability under the Equality Act, Section 109, and a proactive mandate under the Worker Protection Act 2023. In this unforgiving landscape, the only viable way for an employer to defeat vicarious liability is through explicit, documented boundaries.
You need neuroconduct taxonomies to define the specific risks and prevent the BANter trap from taking hold. You need cognitive decay monitoring to prove your training isn't stale, fully satisfying the precedent set by Alley vs. Galen. And you need audit-ready logs to prove to a tribunal judge that you took all reasonable steps. It might feel like rigid engineering, but it is the necessary legal shield. The alternative is unlimited liability.
And to summarize my perspective, dismantling traditional barriers like text-heavy, synchronous grievance systems is essential for equity. The shift toward asynchronous, sensory-friendly reporting that respects cognitive load is a massive step forward.
We definitely agree there.
However, attempting to algorithmically engineer workplace culture through a rigid, scenario-based disciplinary matrix is fundamentally flawed. You cannot reduce human communication to an audit log. By mandating that specific phrases or awkward interactions automatically trigger high-level disciplinary actions like gross misconduct, you risk replacing a neurotypical bias with absolute bureaucratic inflexibility. True workplace equity requires nuance, context, and human mediation, not just mechanical compliance to a standardized matrix.
I mean, we both completely agree that traditional HR policies, which over-rely on intent and vague definitions of professionalism, they systematically fail neurodivergent employees and leave employers legally exposed.
Absolutely.
The old way is legally and morally bankrupt. The core disagreement is entirely over the instrument of change. Is an algorithmic taxonomy of microaggressions the best way to achieve genuine equity? Or does it merely achieve cold legal compliance while missing the human element entirely?
It really highlights the inherent complexity of translating human neurodiversity into rigid legal frameworks. As tribunal claims continue to increase, this tension between granular legal alignment, like the NWAF standards, and organic workplace culture will only continue to evolve.
Definitely.
The long-term effectiveness of these asynchronous, low-friction reporting systems provides rich territory for further exploration. We aren't going to declare a winner today. We leave it to you, the listener, to weigh the merits of compliance architecture versus cultural nuance. We started by talking about radar guns and the desire for engineering precision in the murky world of human behavior.
Right.
The NWAF architecture tries to build a highly sensitive behavioral radar. The question that remains is, when the alarm goes off, does it help us actually understand each other better, or does it just tell us who to penalize?